Hi everybody, this is Luiz Maia and you are watching one more recorded session of our course, The Behavioral Economics of Global Affairs. In our last meeting, we talked a little bit about prospect theory and we talked a lot actually about this very important seminal paper published by Kahneman and Tversky, right? I told you guys this was a fascinating piece of work. It is one of the most cited, if not the most cited paper in the history of economics. And so we end up coming up with these pictures, all right? So I'm trying to refresh your memory a little bit about the prospect theory. Let's start with first with the diagram on your right-hand side of the screen there, okay? Now notice what we have there is a comparison between actual probabilities of some phenomenon and what are considered subjective probabilities of that same event or phenomenon. Okay, so what we are saying here, and we discussed that in class, is that many times when you tell someone that the probability of some event occurring is 10%, well, for small numbers like 10%, people tend to overestimate the probabilities. So we are scared. We are, if I tell you that something bad could happen and that's a 10% probability, people get really scared. Even though the probability is small probabilities, we tend to overweight them. This could be for good things or bad things, right? For example, what are the chances that you're going to get a lottery ticket and all of a sudden you're going to become a millionaire? Well, the chances are very, very, very small. Nevertheless, lots and lots of us do purchase lottery tickets and we have this kind of dream of becoming millionaire instantly, right? So small probabilities, we tend to overweight them. And when we talk about large probabilities, when we say like 85%, if something is very likely, it's 90%, we don't think that is enough. If I tell you that something is 90% likely, people tend to say, well, there is still a big chance that I'm not going to get. So we tend to underestimate large probabilities, okay? We are more concerned about the gap between certainty, 100% probability, and whatever we are told, okay? So this is an important first understanding of what the prospect theory is about. Again, we are talking here about cognitive inclination of human beings, right? So that's what we tend to do whenever we are presented some sort of probability, okay? Now, let's talk for a minute about this left-hand side diagram. This is the one that describes prospect theory in more details, okay? So what we have here, you have like 4 quadrants, right? 4 pieces of the diagram. Let's talk first about this right-hand upper side of the diagram here. So what you have here is basically utility and whatever good you could have, right? So our satisfaction tends to grow, but it grows at a decaying speed, at a smaller and smaller increase as we move along. So this is essentially the most fundamental format of utility function. But when we're talking about probabilities, then we're talking about expected utility theory. It turns out that this format of the utility function tells us that people are risk averse. What that's supposed to mean? Well, if you have to take some risks, you're going to ask for some sort of compensation. You know, you are only willing to take risks if there is a premium, if there's a price for that, there's a compensation for it. If there's not, you will prefer not taking risks. So this first the first area of the diagram is essentially what we have observed in traditional economics. But then these guys came up with the inverse possibility. Let's talk now about losses. First, what we realize with prospect theory, and we got there with a very large number of experiments which were run, which was taken, were implemented, and therefore we have lots and lots of evidence, pieces of evidence confirming this thing. So what we have when we're talking about losses is first that a loss causes much more dissatisfaction, much more harm, or somehow the sensation, the negative sensation, than a similar gain. So losing 100 reais, well, it hurts much more than finding 100 reais just walking down the street, right? So losses, they somehow are, we are more sensitive to losses than to gains. Then we can see that with this inclination being, the curve goes down faster than if we were talking about the upper side of the diagram, okay? So the inclination here is larger. And the second thing is that in this case we have concavity, means people are risk averse. In that case we tend to avoid risks unless we're going to get some premium, some prize to run, to go through with some choice and take risks. When we're talking about losses, on the other side of the diagram, people tend to be risk lovers, risk takers. So we would be willing to run risk if it is to reduce losses. So it goes like, if you lost by 10, you lost by 100. Se time está perdendo de 1-0, ele se arrisca como se ele perder por 1 ou perder por 10, não interessa. All right, so this sort of behavior is very important too, because that was not expected when we first had like the conventional model of how people make choices under risks, okay? So the three most important elements of prospect theory. First, subjective probability. We tend to overestimate small probability and to underestimate large probabilities. Second, people tend to feel much more strong about losses than they feel about similar gains. So, and the third point is that in general, people behave like risk-averse agents when we are talking about gains, but it's very common to see people adopting risk-loving attitudes when we are talking about losses, right? So those are the three elements. And you may ask me, look, Luiz, I think this is interesting, but why is that important? Why was that so influential? Well, as I anticipated before to you, these things have a huge impact on financial markets, and basically whenever we talk about people's behavior regarding risks, right? So some of the implications of this model, of this knowledge, first, that in economics we have developed a number of new models so that we could best explain people's behaviors, right? So now we have models that people don't get satisfaction only for consumption, but from deviations starting from a certain level of consumption. So let's say if you were born rich and you have lots of money, you had your life with easy and access to all material goods that you could imagine. Well, if someone asks you, how is your day? You're going to say, yeah, it's okay. because there was nothing new. I mean, you were stable in a level of very high consumption. For that person, if he or she changes his level of consumption, then he could become happier or something like that. So same thing, it happens if you are a poor person. Well, again, you may have a very good day and with small things if your level of satisfaction has not changed a lot. So first impact is that we have lots and lots of new models, and they have better performances at explaining people's behavior. Then we can look at how people behave in financial markets. And there is this classical fact, if someone buys shares from two companies, stocks, it's an investor, and this person decides to to take some risks in order to have some gains. And then one of the stocks go up 20%. And then the person says, well, that's great. I'm going to sell it. I'm going to realize my profit. I'm going to put the money in my pocket, right? But if the other asset, if the price goes down 25, maybe 30%, people are reluctant to sell it. They say, it's a bad idea to sell right now. The prices are so low. I'm going to wait a little bit more, so a little bit longer, so I think the prices will go up again. All right, so this sort of behavior is not rational, and it leads to, with some frequency, it leads to very large losses in portfolio management. So portfolio management, it is deeply impacted by how people behave and how people deal with risks. We have to develop products or develop analysis and services in the financial market in order to help people make better decisions, right? There are two other possibilities that I wanted to mention as impacts of this knowledge, okay? First is project analysis. As economists, we are familiar with the method of evaluating if a project, if an investment is good or bad. Essentially, what we do, we make projections about the cash flow. A gente faz projeções sobre o fluxo de caixa de projeto, and then we take the present value of that and say, okay, this is a net gain here. A gente tira o valor presente e fala assim, não, o valor presente líquido é um ganho para esse projeto, então esse é um bom projeto. But if you think that this is the traditional method of evaluating a project, we should be very, very, very aware that a better way to evaluate projects is actually to work with different scenarios. So we have to check the sensitivity of your analysis to changes in the underlying hypothesis. Você tem que checar a sensibilidade da sua análise baseada nas mudanças possíveis sobre as hipóteses escondidas, hipóteses implícitas do seu cálculo. And for example, you could have like this cash flow, this projected cash flow for 10 years, and you assume that inflation is constant. Então, se você faz uma expectativa ali de um fluxo de caixa de 10 anos e assume que a inflação está fixa, pode ser que você encontre um resultado que não é real. All right, so from a prospect theory perspective, we would expect people to not only work with this kind of net present value, discounted cash flows, they would also work with different scenarios, a pessimistic scenario, an optimistic one, and then they would try to figure out how large probabilities each of those scenarios have, right? That would be a good way to help people make better decisions, even though we have to be aware that if some negative scenario has a small probability, People will tend to overestimate it, okay? All right, so even if you improve in the method of analysis, you have to be aware on how people will read that information, how subjectively people will consider that information, okay? And finally, I would mention that there's like a whole industry of analysts trying to find the next Google, the next huge company which will come up out of a startup and will become the next big thing, the next Tesla, the next Jeff Bezos, or whatever like that. So people spend most of their times looking for this very small probability phenomenon. That's the reason for that is that we overestimate the small probability of us finding such opportunities, okay? And just to illustrate such a feature, such a perception, let me talk a little bit about Spec. So, special purpose acquisition company. So what is that? Well, that was kind of a fever uh, from some time ago, and it is still going on. It's going on all over the world. We are having lots and lots of people betting their savings, their money, their resources into this kind of financial deal. How does that? How do they work? Let's have a look. First, people gather and form some sort of trust, right? This pool of cash, and this is this is a public company, so essentially using an IPO, initial public offering, they gather these lots and lots of these funds, this huge amount of money, which is uh, raised and somehow gathered for a specific purpose. Then the managers will look for companies which are privately held and they want to purchase that and make those companies public, right? So it's like people were getting together, uh, assembling this new company, essentially to purchase companies with huge growth potential. Então as pessoas apostam o seu dinheiro de uma maneira meio cega nesse grande apanhado de recursos que vai ser entregue a compradores. Esses compradores vão estudar todo o mercado, escolher aquela companhia que tem maior potencial de crescimento, comprar e transformar aquela numa empresa pública. So it is highly speculative, and there is a huge risk involved in such transactions. Nevertheless, people are very, very much willing to make this bet. Even though the probability of huge successes are small, people think that this is the way to go. So it is fascinating how many people are taking this bet, ok? É impressionante um conjunto muito grande de pessoas que acreditam que fazendo essa aposta, que a probabilidade é muito baixa, mas todo mundo acredita que vai ser o dono do próximo Google, eles vão virar milionários com esse tipo de aposta, tá? Alright, so what we are trying to say here is that what we observe in financial markets are much better explained by the prospect theory than the conventional expected utility theory, right? So we have a better capacity of understanding, explaining, and sometimes predicting human behavior as they make financial decisions and as they evaluate and consider risks, okay? So just to finish this recorded session, let me talk a little bit about prospect theory and global warming, climate change. Mas qual que seria a conexão entre teoria do prospecto e aquecimento global, né? Ou as mudanças climáticas? Well, guys, let's remember about how people behave according to the prospect theory. If something has a small probability, we tend to overestimate it. And if I tell someone that reducing a risk of a particular loss from 10 to 3, 10% to 3%, well, that could be like, yeah, this is great, but this is not even comparable to what we would be willing to do if I could tell someone that I were to reduce probability from 3 to 0. And it turns out that we cannot do that. Even if we do all the scientists are telling us to do, if we change completely how we use energy, how we pollute, and how we consume, and create lots and lots of trash and I don't know, a gente cria um monte de resíduos, mesmo que a gente mudasse profundamente o nosso comportamento, a gente não pode reduzir a probabilidade de fenômenos catastróficos climáticos para zero. Então é muito difícil convencer as pessoas quando a gente não pode trazer, senão de 10 para 3 a probabilidade de fenômenos climáticos muito ruins. A gente não pode trazer de 3 para 0. Existe uma probabilidade ainda muito razoável de que a gente vai enfrentar grandes dificuldades em decorrência das mudanças climáticas. And scientists, they cannot, in good faith, honestly, provide reassurance that any foreseeable policy will avoid disaster. We cannot say, oh, if you do that, disaster is avoided. We are good. We cannot say. So solving global warming is out of question. What we can do is to reduce significantly the likelihood of the worst consequences. Now, if I try to sell you this, very honestly, it's really hard because it's not like I'm can assure you that I will reduce to zero the probability of disaster. I can't do that, and we honestly can't assure that. Okay, so it's hard to convince people to join the team and try to fight the worst consequences of climate change. And we can also talk about loss aversion, right? I mean, if you are changing technology, if you're changing the way things are run, companies, business organizations, how they are run, because you want to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, well, they will have to incur some costs, some losses right now to avoid something that could be disastrous in the future. So you say, yeah, come on, now is more important. I will deal with whatever comes up next later on. So we have, again, we have the present bias, we have the uh, planning fallacy or the fallacy of planning, and we have this huge avoidance of immediate losses. We don't want to incur in those losses right now, right? So it's very hard. That's why we are having such a, that's some of the reasons why we're having such a hard time convincing people that we must do something to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. And one more example, just to finish this discussion. The rest of the topics here we're going to see in class next time. But just to finish up this one, think about immigration too, right? Now, when we have like this huge immigration crisis, like lots and lots of Latin American populations trying to get into the US, or when you have lots and lots of African populations trying to cross the Mediterranean and go to Europe, right? Now let's have a look at both sides here. If you are an American person, you know that the chance of you losing your job because some Mexican immigrant came in, it's very small, but it doesn't matter, you know, small probabilities, you tend to overestimate that. So you say, even though it is unlikely I'm going to lose my job to some Mexican guy who came in illegally to the US, even though the probability is very small, oh, it's not that small. Maybe that's why my friend lost his job. That's why you see my point? So you tend to overestimate the probability of a bad event as a consequence of immigration. And on the other hand, if you look at Mexican people and say, if you are a Mexican immigrant, knowing how low your chances are of really making it as you cross the border to the US, will that deter you from trying? Which loss is larger, being deported if you get caught, or never even trying? So they say, if I stay here, my losses are full, are absolute. So I'm going to try, I'm going to run the risks, right? So uh, if you're talking about losses, people will be willing to bet, to take risks if they perceive themselves in a loss situation, right? So uh, we can explain a good deal of behaviors concerning immigration, both from the perspective of the immigrant and the people in the country where to immigration flows are directed, right? So it's one more application of prospect theory, and we learn a lot as we look to reality through those lenses. Well, this is it. This is a short video. I thank you guys who participated, who watched this video, and I will talk to you next time. I'll see you then. Bye bye.